Hey everybody, welcome back to my channel. My name is Stephanie Bree, and in this video, I'm asking the question, was Advanced Dungeons & Dragons better than Basic Dungeons & Dragons? Or just Dungeons & Dragons, as it was known as. Today, they no longer distinguish between Basic and Advanced. It's all one game, and the Basic game has basically been erased and replaced by AD&D, but renamed D&D, supposedly for less confusion in the marketplace, but it's more confusing because it's still Advanced D&D. 5th edition is Advanced D&D, but we call it D&D. But anyways, so back in the 70s and 80s and into the 90s, TSR, the company that created Dungeons & Dragons, had two product lines running simultaneously. Basic Dungeons & Dragons, or just Dungeons & Dragons. This came in a variety of flavors. And Advanced Dungeons & Dragons, which came in two flavors. First edition and then second edition. I know it's confusing, but Basic D&D was essentially a more concise rewording and repackaging of the up to that point existing Dungeons & Dragons material, which fans refer to as OD&D, and assholes with no sense of honor refer to as Zero Edition, because what the fuck ever, they have brain damage, I guess. You can't have a Zero Edition. But anyways, whatever. So in Dungeons & Dragons came in a box set in these 3 pamphlets, and then additional pamphlets with more rules and options were added to the game. And then TSR decided to compile it all together in one book, and they referred to that as Basic Dungeons & Dragons Basic Set. And then they followed that up with Advanced Dungeons & Dragons, hence the naming Basic Dungeons & Dragons, because there was Basic and there was Advanced. Basic Dungeons & Dragons was repackaged in 1980-1981 under the name BX, or Basic Expert. And then it was repackaged again in 1983 as what fans call BECMI, BECMI, which is short for Basic, Expert, Companion, Master, Immortal. And then this was repackaged again in 1991 as the Rules Cyclopedia, just taking all the rules from the first 4 booklets, dropping the Immortal rules, and repackaging it all in a more concise manner again. So this is Dungeons & Dragons. Dungeons & Dragons is a little bit different from Advanced Dungeons & Dragons, or modern D&D, which is an offshoot of Advanced D&D. In Basic Dungeons & Dragons, in original D&D, you have 3 characters to choose from. You can be a fighting man, a magic user, or a cleric. And you can be human, dwarf, elf, or hobbit, and then they later changed hobbit to halfling because the Tolkien estate sued their asses for copyright infringement. And so, yeah, that's why we have halflings instead of hobbits today, but they're still hobbits. So you can call them hobbits, I don't give a fuck, because I'm not selling anything, so Tolkien can kiss my ass from the grave. But anyways, Basic Dungeons & Dragons expanded on that, but also consolidated some stuff. So they removed the option to change your character's what we call race, and instead they introduced race as class. What this means is, in Basic D&D, you weren't an elf fighter wizard or fighter mage. You were just an elf. Your class was elf, and you had attributes of a fighter and attributes of a magic user. But it was, in Advanced Dungeons & Dragons, the equivalent would be picking an elf as your race, and then either being dual class or multi-class elf, elf multi-class fighter wizard. is what it would be the equivalent of. Now, dual classing and multi-classing is considerably more complicated than what you had in basic D&D, hence the term advanced Dungeons and Dragons. Basic D&D also had fewer spells, fewer monsters, and a somewhat simplified rule set. And I say somewhat because the combat system is still mostly the same with an asterisk, because it evolved from OD&D to basic D&D, because in OD&D the combat system was based on chainmail, and then they introduced the optional combat system. But in OD&D, every weapon did a d6 of damage. They introduced scaling damage in one of the pamphlets, did away with it in basic D&D, and then reintroduced it in advanced D&D, and then it just sort of fluctuated. So in advanced D&D, a dagger does a d4, a short sword does a d8, and then a great axe does a d12 of damage, and so on and so forth. But in basic D&D and in original D&D, no matter what weapon you had, even a dagger, a club, a rock, whatever, they all did a d6 of damage. Now, I have read every core rulebook of every edition of D&D. So, I'm not an expert. I haven't played all the different editions. I've just read the rulebooks. So, I can't do a one-to-one, shot-to-shot comparison from one edition to the next, because that's too much fucking information. I can only hit the highlights. And so, basic Dungeons & Dragons and advanced Dungeons & Dragons combat systems still use initiative. They both use initiative. They both use what's known as THAC0, 2-hit armor class 0, which I will never try to explain because I don't fucking understand it. And anyone who says they do, I assume is lying because I don't think it can be understood. And don't come at me. And then you had, once you rolled initiative, you took turns, the group A, the players, and then group B, the monsters. You took turns and then you just fought each other to the death. Advanced Dungeons & Dragons introduced a lot more complicated concepts. It introduced a lot more player options, for one. So instead of the standard races of human, elf, dwarf, and hobbit or halfling, it added to those. It had those, plus it had halfling, gnome, half-orc, and I believe, let me think, I think that's all of them. Basic D&D had fighter, magic user, cleric, and I believe it also had thief, which would later become rogue, and I believe it also had, I don't know if it had ranger or not, but I believe it had druid, and I think paladin was in an expansion. But advanced Dungeons & Dragons also had the assassin and the bard, and which was a multi-class nightmare in advanced Dungeons & Dragons, because you had to start out as a fighter and then stop being a fighter, and then you had to be another thing, and I can't remember what the other thing was, for a few levels. Stop being that thing, and then switch to a third thing for a few levels, and then once you hit the magic number in all 3 levels, you could be a bard. So bards were fucking complicated and convoluted. They simplified that with advanced D&D, but we're not, I mean 2nd edition, but we're not talking 2nd edition. We're just talking 1st edition AD&D and basic, as it existed up to the Rules Cyclopedia in 91, which there were variations from basic, BX, and BECMI. They all had differences, subtle differences. Basic was basically OD&D just repackaged. BX was basic but expanded, and then BECMI was BX expanded even further, essentially. But each time they expanded it, they also revised it and cleaned it up and repackaged it. You know, they're a business. They got to make money. So, a couple of things with Basic versus AD&D. First of all, Basic, as the name implies, is very limited. You can only get up to, I believe, level 5 in Basic. Between 3 to 5. You can't go very far. If you want to advance beyond that, you have to get supplements, which take you up to like level I think up to like level 15 or so. And then once you go beyond that, then you migrate over to Advanced Dungeons and Dragons. So Basic was written as an introductory to D&D. So you would start out with Basic D&D, play to like level 3, and then convert your character to an Advanced D&D character, and then continue playing using the AD&D rules, which was convoluted. Why don't you just create the character using the Advanced rules? I know, whatever. I'm not getting into the nitty gritty. I'm not going to get into the specific details. I'm just going to go in very broad generalizations here. I do have BX. I have Basic Expert. I have both books. I've read both books. No, I've read all of the books. I've read Beck Me and Basic and OD&D and the Real Cyclopedia, etc. But I currently have in my collection, in my possession, BX. Both the Basic book and the Expert book. And I have the Player's Handbook and the Monster Manual for AD&D, which I had as a kid and I've read hundreds of times. So I'm very well versed in them. And despite what certain people on the internet will tell you, Basic is not very playable as a game. And it was designed on purpose to not be playable as a game. The intended purpose of Basic D&D was never to be Dungeons and Dragons. The purpose of Basic Dungeons and Dragons was literally to get you started, to introduce you to the game, and then migrate you to Advanced D&D, which was the real game. We're not going to get into the complicated copyright, legal mumbo-jumbo, court shenanigans that Gary Gygax tried to do to skirt giving Dave Arneson money, which is the real reason why Advanced D&D came into existence, because TSR didn't want to pay Arneson his fair share. We're not going to get into the details of that. We're just going to, that's as much of it as I'm going to give you. You can Google the rest or watch other YouTubers talk about it. However, TSR, they treated the Basic D&D set, the box set, the same way modern day Wizards of the Coast treats the 5th edition starter set. So what you were supposed to do, you buy the starter set as a simplified version of the rules, you play that for a few levels, you get your feet wet, you learn the game, and then you migrate to proper 5th edition, and then you play the game as intended from there. That's what TSR wanted you to do with Basic and AD&D. You start with Basic, and then you migrate to AD&D. Now, the problem was, the monkey wrench in this plan was, there were a lot of people who were playing Basic who didn't want to invest in Advanced Dungeons & Dragons for one reason or another. Either they were too invested in Basic, or they didn't want to spend any more money, or whatever the reason was. And so TSR realized they had to keep the Basic game going longer than they had expected and expand it beyond its intended purpose to keep those players happy, so they would keep buying more products. And they realized that, yeah, if we sell the Companion and the Master and the Immortal box sets, etc., we can make more money and keep these people happy, and they'll keep buying our product because they're not going to buy AD&D. So this is the only way to keep them in the market, as it were. So Beck Me is the only version of basic Dungeons and Dragons, which is fully playable on par with advanced D&D. And what that means is they fleshed out the rules enough that anything you can do in AD&D, you can do in BECMI with some minor modifications. Previously, things like strongholds and hirelings and psionics and the like were exclusive to AD&D. They didn't exist in basic, and so you couldn't, reach level 9 in basic to hire hirelings and build a stronghold, etc., that you could do in advanced D&D. But obviously gamers either had friends who were playing AD&D and knew about these mechanics, or through reading Dungeon Magazine or whatever, schoolyard gossip, whatever, they wanted to do these things too, and TSR realized, hey, yeah, sure, let's just add this shit to the game. Now, I will not go so far as to say BECMI in its completed form, including the Rule Cyclopedia reiteration of it, are unplayable by today's standards. But I will say, going from advanced D&D to 2nd, 3rd, 4th, and 5th edition, or starting with 1st edition and then jumping to 5th edition, is a lot easier than going from BECMI to any other edition. BECMI exists in its own world. Basic Dungeons and Dragons is almost a completely different game than Advanced Dungeons and Dragons. Now, the core game is relatively the same. It's shared storytelling, you play a character, you have combat, you resolve combat, you have spells, etc. But the way you resolve things, conflicts, etc., the way time works, the way encumbrance works, way the weapons available to you, what you can do with weapons, the classes available to you, etc., etc., those are completely different than what you can do in Advanced Dungeons and Dragons. So even though 5th edition, which isn't called 5th edition, by the way, officially by Wizards of the Coast, says on the title of the book, Dungeons and Dragons, it is technically Advanced Dungeons and Dragons. They just dropped the word advanced because they discontinued the basic line, so there's no reason to continue calling it advanced, because it's not, there's nothing that it's advanced compared to. It's just the only product, so therefore it's just Dungeons and Dragons. However, when Wizards took over TSR, they did incorporate things from basic into 3rd edition. So 3rd edition on isn't just Advanced Dungeons and Dragons moving forward. It is Advanced Dungeons and Dragons and Basic Dungeons and Dragons merged into one game and then moving forward. This is mostly evidenced in the fact that Basic D&D was way more heavy on the miniatures because it came from wargaming than Advanced D&D was, which was trying to get away from wargaming. And then TSR brought the wargaming aspects back to D&D for 3rd and 4th edition, realized there was pushback against that, and then basically threw their hands up and said, whatever, you can use miniatures or don't use miniatures, it's up to you. It's a little confusing because they still sell miniatures, but they don't sell the rules for miniatures anymore. The separate game, chainmail, etc. So I don't know, whatever. It is what it is. To answer the question, yes, Advanced Dungeons and Dragons is unequivocally and indisputably better than Basic D&D. But I have to throw this out there, this asterisk. It's only better than Basic and BX, Basic Dungeons and Dragons. It's comparable to BECMI Dungeons and Dragons, which is confusing in and of itself.